Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mississippi. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1846 when the first reports began to surface. In the dense forests of northeastern Mississippi, among the foothills of the Appalachian Range that stretched into the state, local settlers spoke in hushed tones about a figure that moved through the wilderness with unnatural stealth. What began as scattered accounts from hunters and trappers soon evolved into something far more disturbing. A documented case that the Marshall County authorities would eventually file away, never to be spoken of again. It was on a cool October morning that the Wilkinson family reported something unusual at their homestead, located approximately 17 miles northeast of Holly Springs. According to the county records preserved at the Marshall County Historical Society, Samuel Wilkinson, a moderately successful cotton farmer, claimed that someone or something had been systematically hunting game on his property. The curious aspect wasn't the hunting itself, but rather the precision with which it was done. Deer found with a single wound to the neck, rabbits captured with handmade traps of remarkable craftsmanship, all occurring within 300 yards of the main house. The Wilkinson property sat at the edge of what locals called Blackwood Ridge, a heavily forested area that few ventured into without good reason. The ridge formed a natural boundary between the cultivated lands to the west and the deeper wilderness that stretched eastward toward the Alabama Territory. According to tax records from 1845, the Wilkinson estate comprised approximately 420 acres, though only 170 were cleared for cotton production. What makes this case particularly notable was not just the incidents themselves, but what they prefaced, the emergence of a figure that would become known in regional folklore as the Mountain Man of Marshall County, whose real name, according to documents discovered decades later, was Josiah Webb. According to the family Bible preserved by descendants of the Webbs of Tishomingo County, Josiah had been born into slavery somewhere in Virginia in the year 1810, though the exact location remains unverified. What is known with greater certainty is that he was transported to Mississippi in 1828, according to a bill of sale discovered in 1861 during a routine cataloging of estate papers. The journal, attributed to Dr. Thomas Hargrove, a physician who practiced in Marshall County from 1839 to 1852, contains several entries regarding a slave named Josiah, who displayed, in the doctor's words, remarkable aptitude for medicinal herbs and wilderness survival that exceeds any knowledge I have encountered in my studies. The journal entries suggest that Josiah worked primarily as a field hand on the Lancaster plantation, located approximately 7 miles south of Holly Springs. The document that provides the most insight into the early life of Josiah Webb is a curious journal, reportedly discovered in 1957 during renovations of the old courthouse in Holly Springs. According to tax records from 1841, the Lancaster estate was one of the larger operations in the county, with the owner, William Lancaster, holding title to 38 slaves and 600 acres of land. According to an advertisement placed in the Mississippi Palladium on February 3, 1846, Lancaster offered a reward of $300 for the return of a Negro man named Josiah, approximately 35 years of age, 5 feet 11 inches in height, with a scar above his right eye and unusual knowledge of herbal medicine. The advertisement mentioned that Josiah had likely fled northward and was considered dangerous if cornered. What happened during the months following his escape is where documented history blurs with oral accounts collected by amateur historian Elijah Montgomery in 1948. It was in early 1846 that Josiah Webb disappeared from the Lancaster plantation. The circumstances of this disappearance remain a matter of historical debate. According to interviews conducted with elderly residents who claim to have heard first-hand accounts from their parents or grandparents, Josiah did not flee northward as assumed. Instead, he retreated into the most inhospitable terrain of northeastern Mississippi, the densely forested ridges that few white settlers ventured into. It was in April of 1846 that reports of unusual activities began to surface in Marshall County. According to sheriff's records preserved in the state archives, at least 7 homesteads reported thefts of specific items between April and June of that year: a hunting knife from the Fearsome property, medical supplies from Dr. Hargrove's office, seeds from the Wilkinson storage shed, and most notably, several books from the study of Reverend Jonathan Blackwood. What makes these thefts unusual was their selective nature, and the fact that valuable items were often left untouched. According to the report filed by Reverend Blackwood on May 12, 1846, the intruder had taken only 3 books from his extensive library: a medical text on herbal remedies, a surveyor's guide to the Mississippi Territory, and, curiously, a collection of essays by Frederick Douglass that the Reverend claimed was purely for academic study. The turning point in the documented case came on July 7, 1846, when Samuel Wilkinson reported to the marshal, county sheriff, that he had encountered a man in the woods of his property, a Negro man who moved with the stealth and precision of an Indian scout. According to Wilkinson's statement, preserved in county records, the man had been observing the Wilkinson house from a distance of approximately 100 yards, hidden among the dense foliage at the edge of the cleared land. Wilkinson claimed to have pursued the figure into the woods, but lost track of him after less than a quarter mile. What he discovered instead was what appeared to be a temporary camp, a small, carefully constructed lean-to that showed signs of recent occupation, a fire pit that had been designed to produce minimal smoke, and most disturbing to Wilkinson, a series of markings carved into the surrounding trees that he could not decipher but described as methodical and intentional. The sheriff organized a search party the following day, according to county records. The party consisted of Wilkinson, 3 neighboring landowners, and 2 men described in the records as Negro trackers who were experienced in hunting runaway slaves. The search lasted 2 days, but yielded no direct contact with the mysterious figure. However, they did discover something unsettling approximately 3 miles east of the Wilkinson property, a more permanent shelter constructed with remarkable skill in a nearly inaccessible ravine. According to the sheriff's report dated July 10, 1846, the shelter contained evidence of long-term occupation, preserved food, carefully collected rainwater, medicinal herbs organized by type, and most notably, pages from the books stolen from Reverend Blackwood's library, which had been affixed to the inner walls of the shelter. The search party destroyed the shelter and continued their pursuit. But as night fell on the second day, they made the decision to return to Holly Springs, with several members reporting an unsettling feeling of being observed from multiple directions. It was in the weeks following this search that the case took a more disturbing turn. According to an account published in the Mississippi Palladium on August 4, 1846, Lancaster Plantation experienced an unusual incident when 3 of its field slaves disappeared overnight. What made the disappearance particularly notable was that they had taken nothing with them, no provisions, no extra clothing, suggesting either great haste or, as the newspaper speculated, the influence of some external agent familiar with wilderness survival. William Lancaster immediately suspected Josiah's involvement. According to a letter he wrote to the governor, dated August 6, 1846, and preserved in the state archives, Lancaster claimed that Josiah had been quietly subverting the natural order and had likely been planning the escape of others for some time. He requested state militia support to conduct a more thorough search of the region. The governor's response, dated August 12th, expressed sympathy, but noted that resources were limited due to ongoing conflicts with Native American tribes in the northern part of the state. He advised Lancaster to work with local authorities and neighboring plantation owners to address the situation. What followed was one of the largest organized manhunts in pre-Civil War Mississippi. According to sheriff's records, between August 15th and September 7th, 1846, a party of 27 men, including plantation owners, overseers, professional slave catchers, and local farmers, conducted a systematic search of the wilderness areas northeast of Holly Springs. The results of this search are documented in a report dated September 10th. The party found evidence of multiple camps and travel routes throughout the region, suggesting not just survival, but a systematic mapping of the territory. More disturbing to the search party were signs that the fugitives were not merely hiding, but establishing a more permanent presence. Small garden plots in remote clearings, smoking racks for preserving meat, and crude but effective traps set along game trails. The most significant discovery, according to the report, was made on September 3rd, when the search party located what appeared to be a more established settlement deep within a heavily forested valley approximately 15 miles northeast of Holly Springs. The settlement consisted of 3 crude cabins, a central fire pit, and evidence of animal husbandry in the form of a pen that had recently held what the report described as small game, likely rabbits. The settlement was abandoned, but not in haste. According to the report, it appeared that the occupants had deliberately cleared out all useful items and had departed in an organized manner. What they left behind, however, was described by the leader of the search party as a message clearly intended for those who would follow. Carved into a large oak tree at the center of the settlement was a simple symbol, a horizontal line with 3 vertical marks crossing it. No one in the search party could identify the symbol with certainty, though one of the professional slave catchers, a man named Jeremiah Collins, noted in his statement that it resembled marks he had seen used by certain African tribes to denote territory or boundaries. This interpretation was never officially confirmed. The search party spent 3 days attempting to track the fugitives from this abandoned settlement, but found the trails increasingly difficult to follow. According to Collins' statement, it appeared that the fugitives had developed methods to obscure their movements that combined techniques from Native American tribes with what he referred to as African woodcraft. The search was officially abandoned on September 7th, when 2 members of the party were injured in what was described as a deadfall trap of ingenious design that had been placed along what appeared to be a frequently used trail. According to county records, William Lancaster sold his property in Mississippi in November of 1846 and relocated to Louisiana, citing in a letter to a business associate that the climate of Marshall County has proven detrimental to my continued operations. The letter, preserved in the business records of cotton merchant Thaddeus Watkins, makes no explicit mention of the escaped slaves, but notes that Lancaster had lost a total of 7 slaves that year to various circumstances that have rendered my position untenable. From late 1846 through 1848, Marshall County records show a curious pattern of incidents. The aftermath of the failed search is where the documented history becomes particularly interesting. At least 6 smaller farms on the northeastern edge of the settled areas reported livestock disappearing, not slaughtered on sight, as would be common with predators or typical theft, but simply gone. Several homesteads reported observing shadowy figures at the edge of the woods, particularly on nights with partial moonlight. Most notably, according to church records from the Holly Springs Baptist Church, at least 3 families who had settled in the remote northeastern areas of the county abandoned their claims and relocated closer to town, citing in the church minutes uncertain security and a general sense of being unwelcome in that particular territory. The Wilkinson family, whose report had initiated the documented case, appears to have been particularly affected. According to tax records, their productivity declined significantly in 1847, with Samuel Wilkinson reporting only 70 acres under cultivation compared to the previous 170. A letter from Catherine Wilkinson to her sister in Tennessee, dated March 18, 1847, and preserved by descendants, provides some insight into the family's state of mind. Samuel insists on maintaining our claim despite the difficulties of the past year. The children no longer venture beyond the cleared land, and I find myself watching the tree line even at midday. Last week, Samuel discovered another of those markings on a tree at the edge of the north field, the same as before. A line crossed by 3 vertical marks. He removed it immediately, but was troubled to find a small bundle of carefully arranged herbs placed at the base of the tree. He claims they are medicinal and not harmful, but the precision with which they were arranged suggests a message we cannot decipher. The most significant document relating to this period may be the journal of Dr. Thomas Hargrove. In an entry dated January 4, 1848, he writes, "I was called to the Reynolds plantation yesterday to attend to a slave suffering from a severe infection resulting from a logging accident 3 days prior. Upon arrival, I was informed that someone had already treated the wound. The overseer, clearly disturbed, reported that in the early morning hours he had discovered evidence that someone had entered the slave quarters during the night. The injured man's wound had been cleaned, packed with a poultice of what I identified as yarrow and comfrey, and bound with clean cloth of unknown origin. The injured man, when questioned separately, claimed to have seen no one, but admitted to having been given something to drink that induced sleep, after which he awoke to find his wound treated. When I inquired about the possibility of another slave having medical knowledge, the overseer became agitated and mentioned the mountain devil, a term I have heard with increasing frequency among both the white and Negro populations of the northeastern settlements. The term mountain devil appears in several documents from this period, though its exact meaning seems to have evolved over time. In early references, such as Hargrove's journal, it appears to be used with fear and suspicion. However, in accounts collected from former slaves after the Civil War, the term takes on a markedly different connotation. According to interviews conducted by Northern journalist Frederick Wilson in 1871, published in his work, Voices of the Recently Enslaved, Mississippi Accounts, several former slaves from Marshall and neighboring counties spoke of a mountain man who had established a refuge in the wilderness before the war. One account, attributed to a former slave named Moses Jenkins, stated, "There was those who knew how to find him if they had need. It was said he could heal ailments that white doctors couldn't touch, and that he helped those looking to make their way north. Some said he had maps in his head of every trail and stream from Mississippi to Ohio, and that he could move through the forest without disturbing a single leaf. The masters feared him something terrible, called him a devil, and put out rewards, but there were many, even among the white folks, who sought his knowledge of herbs and remedies when conventional medicine failed them." Perhaps the most concrete evidence of Josiah Webb's continued presence in the region comes from an unusual source, the diary of Reverend Jonathan Blackwood. In an entry dated October 12, 1848, Blackwood writes, "I encountered him today. I had ridden to the Harrison property to deliver some religious materials and took a shortcut through the woods on my return journey. a decision that proved most consequential. In a small clearing, approximately 4 miles northeast of town, I came upon a man tending to a garden of what appeared to be medicinal herbs. He was tall, with the bearing of someone who has lived long in the wilderness, and though his skin was dark, his eyes held a quality of intelligence and awareness that immediately struck me. He made no move to flee, which I found surprising given the circumstances. Instead, he addressed me by name, a fact that unsettled me greatly, as I am certain we had never met. He spoke with a curious mixture of dialects, but with a vocabulary that belied significant education. He inquired about my health and that of my wife, mentioning her respiratory troubles that few in the community are aware of. Before I could overcome my astonishment to question him, he presented me with a small bundle of dried herbs, provided precise instructions for their preparation, and suggested they would ease Margaret's breathing considerably. He then simply nodded, as if concluding a routine business transaction, and disappeared into the woods, with a swiftness that defied my ability to track his movement. I remained in the clearing for some time, contemplating whether to report the encounter to the authorities. In the end, I decided against it. There was something in his manner that suggested no threat. Indeed, quite the opposite. I have prepared the herbs as instructed, though I have not yet informed Margaret of their source. A subsequent entry from November 3rd notes that Margaret Blackwood's breathing had improved markedly, and that the Reverend had begun to question certain fundamental assumptions about the natural order as we have constructed it. By 1849, the documented reports of direct encounters with the Mountain Man had decreased significantly, though his influence appears to have remained. According to county records, the areas northeast of Holly Springs developed a curious reputation. White settlement in those regions progressed more slowly than in other areas of similar quality, with several land speculators noting in correspondence that potential buyers often expressed unspecific reservations about certain tracts. The most intriguing document from this later period is an official report filed by U.S. Marshal James Carrington in February 1852. Tasked with investigating suspected Underground Railroad activities in northeastern Mississippi, Carrington reported finding evidence of systematic assistance being provided to runaway slaves throughout the region. His report, preserved in federal archives, states, "There exists in the wilderness areas of Marshall and adjacent counties a network of trails and safe locations that facilitates the movement of fugitive slaves northward." Unlike the more formal Underground Railroad operations observed in other states, this network appears to rely heavily on wilderness survival rather than sympathetic households. Interviews with captured fugitives reveal consistent references to a guide known variously as the Mountain Man or the Herb Doctor, who provides initial assistance and directions. Most concerning is the level of organization evident in these operations. Captured fugitives report being provided with maps marked with specific natural features, knowledge of seasonal water sources, and locations of caches containing food and supplies. Several mentioned receiving medical treatment for existing conditions before beginning their journey. One fugitive, when pressed about the identity of this guide, claimed that he moves between the trees like he's one of them, and that he knows when you're coming before you know it yourself. Carrington's report recommended an increased federal presence in the region, but the recommendation appears to have been lost in bureaucratic processes, as no record of increased enforcement activities exists in subsequent federal documents. The last official record mentioning Josiah Webb by name comes from an unexpected source, a land deed filed in Tishomingo County in 1859. The deed records the purchase of 80 acres of remote woodland by a free Negro man named Isaiah Williams. What makes this document noteworthy is a margin note added by the county clerk, which reads, "Purchaser identified by Dr. T. Hargrove as known to him. Suspicion of being J. Webb of previous notices not substantiated. Funds verified as legitimate from sale of herbal remedies." Whether Isaiah Williams was indeed Josiah Webb operating under an assumed identity cannot be definitively proven, but the timing and circumstances are certainly suggestive. What is documented is that the land in question remained in the Williams family until 1943, when it was sold to the state of Mississippi for inclusion in a nature preserve. The final chapter of this documented case comes from the most unexpected source, a military report filed by Confederate Captain Jeremiah Wilkinson, presumably a relation of the Samuel Wilkinson, whose report had initiated the original case, in April 1864. Assigned to a detail hunting deserters in northeastern Mississippi, Captain Wilkinson reported, "The local population, both white and Negro, maintain persistent superstitions about certain areas of the woodlands northeast of Holly Springs. These beliefs, while typically dismissed as ignorant folklore, have hampered our efforts to locate deserters who have reportedly taken refuge in those regions. Of particular note is the widespread belief in a figure the locals call the Mountain Man, reportedly a runaway slave from before the war who has established a domain in the wilderness where neither Confederate nor Union forces are welcome." While I initially dismissed these accounts as superstitious nonsense, recent events have given me cause to reconsider. 3 days ago, 2 of my men failed to return from a scouting patrol. We discovered them the following morning at the edge of our camp, both unconscious but physically unharmed. Upon regaining consciousness, they reported encountering an elderly Negro man deep in the forest who approached them openly, inquired about their purpose in his woods, and offered them a drink of water from a canteen. Both report no memory after drinking until awakening at the edge of our camp. More disturbing than this encounter was what we found in their possession. Each man had a detailed map showing the locations of all Confederate patrols and checkpoints in the region, information they could not possibly have known, drawn on paper they did not previously possess. Additionally, each carried a small bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth, tied with distinct knots. Local informants suggest these are traditional African protection charms. I'm not a superstitious man, but I find myself reluctant to send further patrols into the northeastern woodlands. There are perhaps some corners of this conflict where neither side is meant to tread. The subsequent movements of Confederate and Union forces in the region show a curious gap in patrol activities precisely in the areas northeast of Holly Springs. A gap that cannot be explained by terrain or strategic considerations alone. What became of Josiah Webb after the Civil War remains largely undocumented. There are scattered references in post-war accounts to an elderly healer living in the remote areas of Tishomingo County who would occasionally provide medical assistance to isolated communities regardless of race. These accounts lack official documentation but persist in family histories collected throughout the region. The land that once constituted the wilderness domain of the Mountain Man has since been largely absorbed into public lands and private timber holdings. The specific locations mentioned in the historical documents, the ravine where the first shelter was discovered, the valley containing the abandoned settlement, the clearing where Reverend Blackwood had his encounter, cannot be precisely identified with modern landmarks. However, in 1963, during a survey conducted prior to the construction of a forestry access road, workers reported discovering unusual stone formations in a remote area approximately 17 miles northeast of Holly Springs. According to the survey report, these formations appeared to be deliberately constructed and included a series of cairns arranged in a pattern that suggested boundaries or trails. The report also noted finding several old trees with unusual markings, horizontal lines crossed by 3 vertical marks. The survey was completed and the road was constructed as planned. The stone formations were not preserved and their exact location was not recorded with precision. Today, the forests of northeastern Mississippi reveal little evidence of this documented case to casual observers. The trails have grown over, the shelters have returned to the earth, and the boundaries marked by cairns and carved trees have been obscured by time. Yet local historians note something curious. Despite over 150 years of development in the surrounding regions, certain pockets of the northeastern wilderness remain largely untouched. Hikers occasionally report feeling unwelcome in specific areas, though they struggle to articulate why. Local hunting guides are known to avoid certain ravines and valleys, citing vague traditions passed down through generations. And perhaps most curiously, according to records maintained by the Mississippi Department of Conservation, plant surveys conducted in 1982 identified unusual concentrations of medicinal herbs growing in patterns that botanists described as suggesting historical cultivation in precisely the areas once associated with Josiah Webb, the most feared mountain man in Mississippi who was once a slave. Yet local historians note something curious. Despite over 150 years of development in the surrounding regions, certain pockets of the northeastern wilderness remain largely untouched. Hikers occasionally report feeling unwelcome in specific areas, though they struggle to articulate why. Local hunting guides are known to avoid certain ravines and valleys, citing vague traditions passed down through generations. And perhaps most curiously, according to records maintained by the Mississippi Department of Conservation, plant surveys conducted in 1982 identified unusual concentrations of medicinal herbs growing in patterns that botanists described as suggesting historical cultivation in precisely the areas once associated with Josiah Webb, the most feared mountain man in Mississippi who was once a slave. What makes the case of Josiah Webb particularly compelling is not just the documented incidents themselves, but the ripple effects that continued long after his active presence in the region had faded from public record. According to land ownership maps from 1870 through 1900, the areas most strongly associated with Webb's activities remained largely undeveloped despite their potential agricultural value. Local newspaper accounts from this period occasionally reference the haunted woods or cursed valleys northeast of Holly Springs, though these references appear to be based on superstition rather than documented incidents. The oral histories collected by researcher Elijah Montgomery in the 1940s provide perhaps the most intriguing glimpse into how the legacy of Josiah Webb transformed over generations. Montgomery, a history professor at Rust College in Holly Springs, conducted extensive interviews with elderly residents of Marshall and surrounding counties, focusing particularly on stories passed down through both white and black families about the pre-Civil War era. According to Montgomery's notes, archived at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, the figure of the mountain man had evolved into something more complex than a simple bogeyman. In accounts from descendants of former slaves, Webb was described as a protector and healer, someone who had carved out a territory where the normal rules of the antebellum South did not apply. One account, attributed to 87-year-old Harriet Johnson, whose grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Holly Springs, stated, "Grandmama told us children that if we ever got lost in the deep woods, we should look for trees marked with 3 lines crossing one. She said those marks meant you were in his territory, and that he watched over anyone who respected the land. She said he knew every plant that could heal and every plant that could harm, and that even after the war, when she was free but times were still hard, sometimes she would find bundles of herbs left near their cabin when someone was sick." Contrasting accounts from white families painted a more ambivalent picture. According to Montgomery's interview with William Blackwood, grandson of Reverend Jonathan Blackwood, family stories describe the mountain man as neither friend nor enemy, but something altogether different, a force of nature that demanded respect. The younger Blackwood shared a story passed down through his family. My grandfather maintained until his death that on 3 separate occasions after their first encounter, he returned to that same clearing and left copies of various books, medical texts primarily, but also works of philosophy and natural science. Each time, the books would be gone when he returned, and occasionally he would find in their place small packages of herbs or handcrafted items that seemed to address specific needs within the family. My father recalled that in 1868, when an outbreak of fever struck Holly Springs, grandfather spent 3 days in the northeastern woods and returned with treatments that saved many lives. He never directly attributed these to the mountain man, but the implication was clear to those who knew the history. Perhaps the most unusual document in Montgomery's collection is a letter dated November 12, 1871, from William Lancaster, Jr., son of the original plantation owner from whom Josiah Webb had escaped. Having returned to Mississippi to assess family properties after the war, the younger Lancaster wrote to a business associate, "I have decided against attempting to reclaim the northeastern parcels. The land itself appears fertile enough, but there is a persistent local superstition regarding those woods that would make labor difficult to secure. More troubling was my experience while surveying the boundaries, a sense of being observed that I cannot rationally explain, and the discovery of those same markings my father described in his journals. It has been 25 years, and yet the presence remains. Some territories, I have concluded, are simply not meant for certain enterprises." The transformation of Josiah Webb from fugitive to local legend appears to have been completed by the early 20th century. A folklorist's account published in the Journal of Southern Folklore in 1923 describes the legend of the mountain man as a common tale told throughout northeastern Mississippi, with variations that reflected the complex racial dynamics of the region. In white communities, the story often emphasized the fear and uncertainty experienced by early settlers, while in black communities, the emphasis was on resistance, survival, and the preservation of African knowledge and traditions. What makes the case of Josiah Webb distinct from purely legendary figures is the extensive documentation that anchors the story in historical reality. The advertisements for his capture, the sheriff's reports, the journal entries from Dr. Hargrove and Reverend Blackwood, these provide a factual framework around which the legend grew. In 1952, during expansions to the county road system, construction workers discovered what appeared to be the remnants of a small settlement in a remote valley approximately 16 miles northeast of Holly Springs. More intriguing was the discovery of a cache of items buried beneath one of the stone foundations, a metal box containing surgical instruments of mid-19th century design, glass vials that had once contained various substances, pages from medical texts that had been carefully preserved between layers of treated hide, and most notably, a journal written in what experts from the University of Mississippi later identified as a mixture of English and Igbo, an African language, primarily associated with present-day Nigeria. According to the foreman's report filed with the county engineer's office, they uncovered stone foundations for 3 small structures arranged in a triangular pattern around a central area that showed evidence of long-term fire use. The journal was sent to linguists at Howard University for further study, but according to county records, it was lost in transit. Only photographs of several pages remain in the Marshall County Historical Society archives, along with partial translations that suggest it contained detailed information about medicinal plants, seasonal cycles in the northeastern Mississippi wilderness, and what appears to be a record of people who passed through the settlement over a period of approximately 15 years. The archaeological evidence, while limited, provides further support for the documented narrative. In 1967, a graduate student in archaeology from the University of Mississippi conducted a systematic survey of areas identified in historical records as associated with Josiah Webb. The resulting thesis, Evidence of Maroon Settlements in Antebellum, Mississippi, documented findings consistent with the historical accounts. The remnants of carefully constructed shelters in nearly inaccessible locations, evidence of small-scale agriculture in remote clearings, and a network of trails that connected these sites while remaining largely invisible from more traveled routes. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of additional trees bearing the distinctive mark attributed to Webb, a horizontal line crossed by 3 vertical marks. Carbon dating conducted on several of these marks indicated they had been made between 1845 and 1865, precisely the period when Webb was most active in the region according to historical documents. The graduate student, David Thompson, proposed in his thesis that what the historical records described as a single individual may actually have represented a small community of escaped slaves who had established a maroon settlement in the wilderness areas of northeastern Mississippi. Similar communities had been documented in the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina and in the bayous of Louisiana, but Thompson's research represented one of the first academic acknowledgments of such communities in Mississippi. Thompson's thesis advisor, Dr. James Wilson, noted in his foreword to the published work, "What makes the case of Josiah Webb and the northeastern Mississippi Maroons particularly significant is not just their existence, but the evidence suggesting their interactions with the surrounding communities." Unlike many maroon settlements that survived through isolation alone, the documentary evidence indicates that Webb and his associates maintained a complex relationship with both enslaved and free people in the region, and even with certain members of the white community. In 1974, the discovery of additional documents in the attic of the old Hargrove House in Holly Springs added another layer to the historical record. Among papers belonging to Dr. Thomas Hargrove was a small notebook containing what appeared to be formulas for medicinal preparations, alongside notes regarding their efficacy in treating various conditions. A notation on the inside cover in Hargrove's handwriting reads, "Remedies learned from J.W., 1849 to 1858. To be kept in confidence as promised." The notebook contains detailed instructions for preparing treatments for numerous ailments, from fever and digestive complaints to more serious conditions like infections and respiratory diseases. Botanical experts from the University of Mississippi who examined the formulas in 1976 noted that many contained plants known to have medicinal properties, combined in ways that reflected both European medical traditions and practices documented in West African healing traditions. Dr. Eleanor Richards, professor of pharmaceutical sciences, wrote in her analysis of the notebook, "What is particularly remarkable about these formulations is not just their likely efficacy, but the sophisticated understanding of dosage, preparation methods, and contraindications they reveal. These are not folk remedies based merely on tradition, but evidence of a systematic approach to medicine that combines empirical observation with inherited knowledge." The most recent documented connection to Josiah Webb came in unexpected form in 1985, when a historical preservation project in Tishomingo County uncovered tax and property records relating to Isaiah Williams, the free black man who had purchased land in 1859 that some historians believe may have been Webb operating under an assumed name. Among these records was a will dated 1876 in which Williams distributed his property among several individuals identified only by first names, with descriptions suggesting they were formerly enslaved people who had settled in the area after the Civil War. The will includes specific instructions regarding the northeastern portion of his land. The 40 acres encompassing the 3 springs and the old settlement are to remain undisturbed and undeveloped in perpetuity. This land has provided sanctuary and healing to many in need and shall continue to do so. The markings on the boundary trees are to be maintained by those who understand their significance. The will was executed according to its terms, and the land in question remained in communal use by descendants of the named beneficiaries until 1943, when economic pressures forced its sale to the state. However, deed restrictions included in the sale maintained the prohibition on development of the northeastern section, a restriction that remains in force today as part of the State Forest Management Plan. The story of Josiah Webb, documented in official records, preserved in oral histories, and evidenced in archaeological findings, presents a counter-narrative to traditional understandings of resistance in the antebellum South. While much historical attention has focused on those who escaped slavery by fleeing northward or through organized channels like the Underground Railroad, Webb represents those who carved out spaces of autonomy within the South itself. Dr. Rachel Johnson, in her 2004 work Hidden Histories of Resistance in the Deep South, argues that Webb's case is particularly significant because it transcends the individual. The documented evidence suggests that Webb created not just a hiding place, but a system, a network of safe locations, communication methods, and knowledge transfer that supported others seeking freedom or autonomy. Perhaps most remarkably, this system appears to have survived in various forms, long after Webb himself disappeared from the historical record. The persistence of Webb's influence can be traced through subsequent generations. According to records from the Freedmen's Bureau established after the Civil War, the areas of Marshall and Tishomingo counties associated with Webb's activities saw unusually high rates of land acquisition by formerly enslaved people between 1865 and 1875. Many of these small landholdings were located in or near the regions historically connected to Webb, suggesting that knowledge of the territory and perhaps community connections had been maintained. Church records from the African Methodist Episcopal Congregation, established in Holly Springs in 1868, include references to an elder who dwells in the wilderness, who occasionally provided assistance to community members in need. While never explicitly identified as Webb, who would have been approximately 58 years old at that time, the descriptions align with historical accounts of his activities. The last potential first-hand account of Josiah Webb appears in a memoir written by Eliza Thompson, a nurse who worked with the Freedmen's Bureau in northern Mississippi from 1865 to 1870. In an entry dated July 1869, she writes, "Today I was taken to meet a remarkable individual living in the remote woodlands. My guide, a former slave who now owns a small farm near the forest edge, spoke of this man with unusual reverence. We traveled several hours along barely visible trails before reaching a small clearing containing a well-built cabin surrounded by carefully tended gardens of medicinal plants. The occupant was an elderly Negro man of dignified bearing who welcomed us as if expected. Though he introduced himself as Isaiah, my guide later confided that this was the man known during slavery times as Josiah, who had established a sanctuary in these woods for those seeking freedom. He shared with me several treatments for the summer fevers that have been afflicting the freedmen's settlements, treatments that proved remarkably effective upon my return. What struck me most was not just his knowledge, but his demeanor. that of a man who had created his own domain and lived according to his own principles through decades when such autonomy seemed impossible for those of his race. As we departed, he walked with us to what he described as the boundary of his territory, marked by a tree bearing 3 vertical lines crossing a horizontal one. "Beyond this," he said, "lies their world with their rules. Within it lies mine." If this account indeed describes Josiah Webb, it would place him in the region as late as 1869, when he would have been approximately 59 years old. No definitive record of his death exists, though local folklore suggests he lived well into his 80s, continuing to provide healing and guidance from his wilderness domain until sometime in the 1890s. What remains most clearly documented is the lasting impact on the region. Maps of Marshall and Tishomingo counties from the late 19th and early 20th centuries show curious gaps in development, areas that logically should have been settled or developed for agriculture but remained largely untouched. Many of these areas correspond to locations identified in historical records as part of Webb's territory. Local newspaper accounts from this period occasionally mention the reluctance of workers to enter certain areas of the northeastern woodlands. An article in the Holly Springs Gazette from 1907 describes a logging operation that was abandoned after workers repeatedly reported unsettling experiences and refused to return to a particular valley. The article quotes the foreman as saying, "There are some places where history still has too strong a hold for progress to take root." This sentiment appears to have persisted well into the 20th century. During the Depression era, when many marginally productive lands were being brought into cultivation out of economic necessity, surveys conducted by the Department of Agriculture noted that certain tracts in northeastern Mississippi remained unclaimed despite being offered at minimal prices through various land distribution programs. The report, dated 1936, includes a curious footnote. Local residents express reluctance to develop parcels, 47 to 53, despite favorable soil conditions. Reasons cited include poor access and traditional boundaries, though no legal restrictions were found in deed research. Today, much of the area historically associated with Josiah Webb has been incorporated into the Holly Springs National Forest, or preserved as part of state wildlife management areas. The specific locations mentioned in historical documents, the ravine containing the first shelter, the valley with the settlement, the clearing where Reverend Blackwood had his encounter, cannot be precisely identified with modern landmarks due to changes in the landscape and the deliberate remoteness of the original sites. However, park rangers and forestry workers occasionally report finding trees with unusual markings in the more remote sections of the forest. Horizontal lines crossed by 3 vertical marks carved decades ago and now nearly grown over. These discoveries are rarely officially documented, existing primarily in the stories shared among those who work regularly in the wilderness areas. In 2011, a botanical survey conducted by researchers from Mississippi State University identified several unusual concentrations of medicinal plants in remote sections of the Holly Springs National Forest. The plants, including black cohosh, bloodroot, wild ginger, and numerous others with documented medicinal properties, were growing in patterns that suggested deliberate cultivation rather than natural distribution. Carbon dating of soil samples from these areas indicated sustained human activity from approximately 1845 to 1900. Dr. Michael Richardson, who led the survey, noted in his report, "These plant communities represent living artifacts of historical ethnobotanical practices. The specific combinations of medicinal species, their planting patterns, and their continued persistence long after active cultivation ceased suggest a sophisticated understanding of both the plant's medicinal properties and their ecological requirements." The most recent connection to the documented case came in 2017, when the Marshall County Historical Society received a donation of family papers from the descendants of Samuel Wilkinson, the farmer whose report had initiated the official record of Josiah Webb's activities. Among these papers was a letter written by Wilkinson to his son in 1867, containing a passage that provides a fitting epilogue to the documented case. You ask about the stories you heard as a child regarding the man in the woods. I can tell you now what I would not then, that he was real, and that the fear he inspired in me and other landowners was not without cause, though perhaps not for the reasons we believed at the time. What we took for a threat to our property and way of life was, I have come to understand, something altogether different. A man who had created something we could not comprehend, freedom on his own terms, in a place we thought we controlled. I have not ventured into the northeastern woods since 1852, when I encountered him for the final time. I had gone hunting alone, against the advice of neighbors who still held to fears of the mountain devil. In a clearing I had never seen before, though it was not 3 miles from our property, I found him waiting, older but unmistakable. He spoke to me by name, not as a former slave might address a white man, but as one landowner to another. Your boundaries end here, he said, pointing to a tree marked with his sign. Mine begin. We have both lived with this understanding for many years now. I see no reason for that to change. He then presented me with a small bundle of herbs, which he said would help your mother's lingering cough. I took it, though my hand trembled, not from fear as it once would have, but from the strange recognition of standing at the border between 2 worlds that existed in the same place. I never saw him again, though sometimes, even now, I find similar bundles at the edge of our property when illness visits our household. Your mother believes they are gifts from Providence. Perhaps she is not wrong. The documented case of Josiah Webb, the most feared mountain man in Mississippi who was once a slave, represents more than a curious historical footnote or local legend. It provides a documented example of resistance and autonomy, created within the very heart of the antebellum South, a man who transformed his status from property to sovereign through knowledge, strategic thinking, and profound understanding of the landscape. The fear he inspired among white settlers arose not just from the unknown, but from the fundamental challenge his existence presented to the established order. Here was a man who had not only escaped the system, but who had created his own domain where that system's rules did not apply. A territory where a formerly enslaved man determined boundaries, established rules, and moved with complete autonomy. The physical traces of Josiah Webb's presence in northeastern Mississippi have largely faded with time. The shelters have returned to the earth, the trails have grown over, and the boundaries marked by cairns and carved trees have become obscured. Yet in the uncultivated valleys, the unusual concentrations of medicinal plants, and the persistent reluctance of locals to venture into certain remote areas, his influence remains. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in the documented transmission of knowledge. The medical notebooks of Dr. Thomas Hargrove, the botanical patterns identified by modern researchers, the oral histories of healing practices passed down through generations of both black and white families in the region. All suggest that Webb's understanding of medicinal plants and natural systems survived long after he himself disappeared from the historical record. In this way, the documented case reveals something profound about resistance and legacy. Josiah Webb's most significant achievement may not have been simply escaping slavery or even establishing a territory of his own, but rather creating a system of knowledge and practice that continued to benefit the surrounding communities. Both those he sought to help and those who had once sought to capture him long after the immediate circumstances of his life had changed. Today, the forests of northeastern Mississippi appear little different from any other wilderness area in the region to casual observers. But those familiar with the documented history sometimes report a distinct feeling when passing certain unmarked boundaries, a sense of transitioning from one domain to another, of being observed, of entering a place where different rules might apply. In the words of local historian Margaret Jackson, writing in 2020, the power of Josiah Webb's story lies not just in what he did, but in what he continues to do. In a region whose history is dominated by narratives of oppression and control, he created a counter-narrative of autonomy and self-determination that has persisted through generations. In the unmarked boundaries he established, the knowledge he preserved and shared, and the legend he became, we find a documented reminder that resistance takes many forms, and that some territories, once claimed, can never truly be reclaimed by others. The U.S. Forest Service officially maintains that there are no restricted or special management areas within the Holly Springs National Forest based on historical or cultural considerations outside of documented archaeological sites. Yet rangers who have worked in the area for decades sometimes tell a different story to new recruits, about certain valleys and ravines where equipment mysteriously malfunctions, where planned developments are repeatedly delayed by bureaucratic complications, and where hikers often report feeling unwelcome for reasons they cannot articulate. And occasionally, though such reports are never officially filed, there are stories of rangers finding small bundles of carefully arranged medicinal herbs left at the bases of old trees marked with nearly grown-over symbols, a horizontal line crossed by 3 vertical marks, particularly in areas where forest workers or visitors have recently been injured or fallen ill. The documented case of Josiah Webb, the most feared mountain man in Mississippi who was once a slave, remains open, not because the man himself still walks the forests of northeastern Mississippi, but because the boundaries he established between worlds continue to be honored, even by those who no longer remember why.